April 21st, 1836. Rebels in the northern part of Mexico's state of Coahuila y Texas, under Sam Houston, defeat forces of the Mexican Republic under President Antonio López de Santa Anna. At the Battle of San Jacinto, the Texan rebels capture Santa Anna in a nearby swamp, disguised in a regular soldier's uniform the next day. Rebel forces hold him captive until he agrees to sign the Treaties of Velasco. These treaties, one private and one public, grant Texas its independence and draw its new border between the Republic of Mexico and the Republic of Texas at the Rio Grande River. In secret, the Texans agree to release Santa Anna contingent on Santa Anna's pledge to influence Mexico to recognize Texan independence. However, the central government of Mexico rejects the validity of the Treaties of Velasco, asserting Santa Anna had no authority to sign the treaties while captive. Although short-lived, the Treaties of Velasco offer the young Republic of Texas a leg to stand on, as its claim to the Rio Grande sets the foundation of the Mexican-American War. September 5, 1836, the newly formed Republic of Texas holds its first presidential election. Texans overwhelmingly vote 43-year-old Sam Houston, Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the Texas Revolution, as their first president. Additionally, they ratify their constitution and approve a proposal of annexation to the United States. President Houston sees little chance his new republic will last without external backing, as Mexico still views Texas as little more than a rebellious territory, yet to be brought to heel. Houston attempts to start negotiations for annexation with the United States, but to his surprise, President Andrew Jackson chooses to delay negotiations. Although expansion has dominated early American history, the potential annexation of Texas becomes a polarizing issue. In the United States, tension is building leading up to the presidential election of 1836. With President Andrew Jackson completing his second term, he aims to make sure Texas annexation isn't an obstacle for his successor. Additionally, Mexico informs America that annexation of Texas will be seen as an act of war. However, perhaps most importantly, annexation of Texas could upset the Union's delicate balance between its ever-divided North and South. In 1836, the United States maintains an even number of free states and slave states. This unique balance remains vitally important, as if one side has more senators than the other, they could pass legislation harmful to the interests of their political opponents. Jackson manages to keep Texas annexation on the back burner, and his vice president, Martin Van Buren, wins the presidency in 1836. With Van Buren mirroring Jackson's Texas policy, Texas annexation remains politically untenable until 1843. In 1843, Sam Houston, re-elected president in 1841, begins negotiations mediated by Britain with Mexico on potentially rejoining Mexico as an autonomous state. Learning about these negotiations, President John Tyler dispatches U.S. Secretary of State Abel P. Upshur to bring Texas to the table. Tyler, 51 and Virginia born, was expelled from the Whig Party less than a year after replacing William Henry Harrison as president. So, to salvage his presidency, Tyler sets his sights on foreign affairs and ties himself to expansionist, pro-slavery policies. Houston, initially hesitant about American support for Texas statehood, is more than skeptical, but after Upshur tells Houston 40 out of the 52 members of the Senate support Texas annexation, the two countries begin hashing out a treaty for annexation. To keep Mexico at bay, Tyler moves the U.S. Army to the Louisiana-Texas border. Tragically, when the treaty is near complete, Upshur is killed in an accident on a pleasure cruise aboard the USS Princeton on February 28, 1844. Tyler himself is nearly killed in the accident, but luckily is below deck. Upshur's loss proved devastating for Tyler's plan, as Upshur was expected to draw critical support from the Senate for the issue. Tyler replaces Upshur with highly respected but controversial John C. Calhoun as Secretary of State. Despite some concerns, Calhoun finalizes a treaty with Texas, aptly called the Tyler-Texas Treaty. Tyler submits the treaty to the Senate in late April 1844. The 1844 presidential election is still a toss-up by late May. The Whigs nominate Henry Clay, staunchly against annexation, and known as the Great Compromiser. Clay hopes to avoid discussion on the divisive subject of Texas. For the Democrats, former President Martin Van Buren immediately stands out. However, Van Buren announces his opposition of Texas annexation, deeply upsetting many pro-expansionist Southerners. However, Van Buren expects the opposition to sway voters of his home state, New York. On May 27th, in the city of Baltimore, the Democratic Convention of 1844 begins. Van Buren's prime opponent is Louis Cass, former ambassador to France. Cass is strongly in favor of Texas annexation. He hopes he can use the issue to upend Van Buren's popular support. Throughout the first 7 ballots, Van Buren steadily loses support to Cass. However, on the 8th ballot, a Massachusetts delegate nominates former Speaker of the House James K. Polk. Polk, the protege of his fellow Tennessean Andrew Jackson, is energetically in support of Texas annexation. On the 8th ballot, Polk gains some initial support, but not enough for a nomination. However, on the 9th ballot, Van Buren instructs his delegates to cast their votes in support of Polk, giving him the necessary 2/3 majority to gain the nomination. On June 8th, the Tyler-Texas Treaty is defeated in the Senate by a coalition of Whigs and Northern Democrats, 16 yea, 35 nay. Later that year, James K. Polk narrowly defeats Henry Clay to win the presidency by a mere 40,000 votes. When Congress reconvenes in late December 1844, Tyler reignites his efforts to annex Texas. With James K. Polk's support, Tyler proposes the treaty as a joint resolution, only requiring a majority in the House and the Senate. On January 25th, the Senate barely approves the resolution, 27 yea, 25 nay. The treaty easily passes in the House in late February, 132 yea, 76 nay. Tyler signs the treaty on March 1st, 1845, just 3 days before Polk takes office. But as the issue of Texas annexation subsides, new problems clamor to take its place. Texas, now officially part of the United States, brings its many problems with it. The territory is penniless, bringing with it its $10 million of debt to the Union. America also inherits a border dispute from the Republic of Texas, claiming its southern border at the Rio Grande. Conversely, Mexico claims that Texas ends at the Nueces River. Mexico cuts all ties with America after the vote, but looks for other ways to halt Texas annexation. The British also hope to deny annexation, as it aims to deter American expansion and protect their trade interests in Texas. Polk looks for ways to avoid war with Mexico. He pursues a strategy called graduated pressure. In an attempt to bring Mexico to the negotiating table, Polk will pressure Mexico militarily, as he believes that Mexico would like to avoid a war. In late May, General Zachary Taylor receives orders to prepare his troops for a defense of Texas the moment annexation is accepted. Taylor, now 60 years old, earned the nickname Old Rough and Ready during the Seminole Wars for his willingness to fight beside his men. On July 4, 1845, Texas nearly unanimously accepts annexation, further enraging Mexico. Later that summer, pro-annexation writer John L. O'Sullivan publishes an essay called Annexation, in a spirit of hostile interference against us, for the avowed object of thwarting our policy and hampering our power, limiting our greatness and checking the fulfillment of our manifest destiny, to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. The War Department initially plans for Taylor to sail to a healthful position on or near the Rio Grande, well suited to repel any invasion. However, Taylor, stationed at Fort Jessup in Louisiana, decides to ignore the administration's plans. Instead, he commands 1,500 infantry to sail from New Orleans over the Gulf of Mexico to Corpus Christi, and his cavalry to ride overland to Corpus Christi on July 24th, on the mouth of the Nueces River. Taylor decides to avoid the Rio Grande, as he knows little of the terrain south of the Nueces. Additionally, his army was too weak to contend with a 3,000-strong Mexican force, rumored to be headed to Matamoros. By August 12th, Taylor receives an updated report stating that Matamoros is only defended by 500 soldiers, with an additional 1,000 soldiers en route. On September 16th, Polk receives a message from a confidential agent in Mexico City indicating Mexican President José Joaquín de Herrera's willingness to negotiate. Polk chooses John Slidell to be his negotiator and tasks him with securing Mexican agreement to the Rio Grande boundary. Additionally, Slidell is granted authority to purchase the western half of the Mexican state of New Mexico for up to $5 million and, in addition, a settlement granting the United States the territory of California for up to $25 million. By mid-October, Taylor commands more than 3,900 soldiers, approximately half of the U.S. Army's total strength. His force consists of 4 infantry and 1 dragoon regiment, and a regiment-sized battalion of red-legged infantry, artillerymen who acted as infantry. The American Army, accustomed to fighting Indians in small dispersed units, lacks experience fighting large-scale battles, as it has not done so since the War of 1812. When the Army reaches Texas, they begin extensive training, as the possibility of war remains. Slidell reaches Veracruz on November 30th and proceeds to Mexico City. Slidell's arrival proves disastrous for Herrera's government, as he is labeled a traitor by his opposition. The Mexican government requests Slidell postpone his arrival until at least late January, but he ignores the request and arrives on December 8th. The Mexican government immediately questions the discrepancy in Slidell's rank, as they had requested a commissioner, but Slidell was sent as a minister. Partly due to Mexico's tumultuous political setting, Mexico decides against receiving Slidell. So Slidell retires to Jalapa and awaits further instruction. Although Herrera attempted to maintain popular support, his efforts were futile. In San Luis Potosí, Major General Mariano Paredes Arriaga, leader of the Mexican Army of the North, rebels against Herrera's government and marches on Mexico City. Paredes accuses Herrera of compromising Mexico's honor by his acceptance of Slidell and willingness to negotiate. On December 29th, the garrison of Mexico City defects and Herrera is forced to abandon the presidential palace. On January 2nd, Paredes is proclaimed President of Mexico and immediately states his intention to uphold Mexican territorial integrity as far as the Sabine River in his inaugural address. The adamant stance Paredes took on Texas set in motion the events that would begin the Mexican-American War. Polk is informed of Mexico's decision to reject Slidell. On January 12th, Polk is dismayed, and his frustrations with Mexico reach a boiling point. He immediately orders General Zachary Taylor to move to the Rio Grande, but not to consider Mexico an enemy until he is attacked. On March 1st, Slidell makes a final request for reconsideration of his recognition. Unsurprisingly, Mexico rejects his request a few days later. Taylor receives Polk's orders on February 3, 1846. After a reconnaissance of the Matamoros Road, he orders his men to prepare to march and disembarks on March 8th. Many of Taylor's troops are eager to leave Corpus Christi. During the past few months, Taylor's troops have drilled incessantly and have become eager for a real battle. Additionally, the brackish water the troops had to consume caused mass amounts of dysentery. On March 19th, Taylor reaches the Arroyo Colorado River. He receives a message from Mexican General Francisco Mella, stating Mexico will contest the crossing. This is backed up by the sound of Mexican bugles from across the river. Taylor orders an immediate crossing of the river. At 10:30 a.m., 4 light infantry companies under Captain Charles F. Smith cross the river. Once they struggle up the banks, they catch a glimpse of a few Mexican horsemen making their escape. Mella's ruse has failed. Next, Taylor directs his army to Point Isabel. The coastal city is preferable to Corpus Christi as a supply depot due to its deep water port and proximity to the Rio Grande. On March 24th, he reaches Point Isabel and finds it undefended. He orders construction of a fort and departs toward the Mexican city of Matamoros. By mid-morning, March 28th, Taylor's troops caught sight of Matamoros. Some residents of the city climb to any vantage point they can to catch a glimpse of this foreign army. The American army encamps on an open field across from Matamoros. Taylor sends a message to General Francisco Mella to inform him his intentions are entirely peaceful. The Mexicans could do nothing but accept Taylor's message, as Matamoros was defended by a mere 2,000 men, compared to Taylor's 4,000. The Mexican soldiers defending Matamoros are in lackluster condition. They suffer from malnutrition and disease. Taylor orders preparations for permanent encampments. The principal encampment, a star-shaped earthwork, capable of holding 800 men, he names Fort Texas. During the construction of Fort Texas, Taylor faces the challenge of desertions. Many American soldiers flee to Matamoros to avoid the rigors of military life. In total, nearly 200 soldiers swim across the Rio Grande during Taylor's stay. On April 11th, Major General Pedro de Ampudia arrives at Matamoros. He has ridden 180 miles from Monterrey in just 4 days with his 200-man light cavalry escort. In addition, 2,200 soldiers are just 3 days behind, under the command of Brigadier General Anastasio Torrejon. Ampudia eagerly prepares to cross the Rio Grande, but when Torrejon arrives, Ampudia is informed that General Mariano Arista will take control of the Army of the North. The red-haired 42-year-old Arista, who joined the Mexican Army at age 11, commanded the Army of the North prior to the Paredes revolt. However, Arista was ousted for his lack of support of President Mariano Paredes. But by April 1846, Paredes is in desperate need to consolidate support in his northern region and reinstates Arista. Arista orders Torrejon and 1,600 troops to cross the Rio Grande at La Planjana, about 15 miles upstream from Matamoros. Torrejon's force consists of cavalry, sappers, and light infantry. He is to travel to the Point Isabel Road and cut off the American force from their supplies and force them out into an open battle. Taylor receives a report of the Mexican crossing and sends Captain Croghan Kerr east with a detachment of dragoons to investigate, but Kerr finds nothing. He then sends Captain Seth Thornton with another detachment of dragoons upstream to search for Torrejon. Thornton travels 25 to 30 miles upstream, interrogating Mexican ranchers along the way. Early the next morning, Thornton arrives at Rancho de Caricitos, a ranch closed off by a fence with one entrance and the Rio Grande River. He sees a group of Mexicans working on some buildings and attempts to interrogate them, but they flee. In their haste, the Americans neglect to guard the entrance to the ranch. A little while later, Torrejon arrives at the ranch and finds it unguarded. He stations some of his soldiers around the fence and completely traps the Americans. When Thornton and his men return to the entrance, a skirmish ignites. Thornton charges at the Mexican line with his men in an attempt to break through and escape. However, Mexican fire is too intense and cuts down many of his dragoons. The remainder of his men veer off to the right, but are continually fired on by the soldiers surrounding the ranch. The Americans retreat further into the Rancho de Caricitos and are faced with surrender or certain death. Some men attempt to swim across the Rio Grande, but finding it too boggy, they turn around. With no other option, Captain William J. Hardy issues a surrender to Torrejon. Most of the remaining men are taken as prisoners of war, but Torrejon sends the injured back to the American camp. In total, 11 Americans lie dead, with 6 wounded. In his report to President Polk, Taylor writes, "Hostilities may be considered to have commenced. American blood has been spilled. The war with Mexico has begun."